First of all, I would just like to introduce the topic, and then we will start our webinar. So we have been observing that Turkey has been going through a transformation since the AKP has come to power. And firstly, there were hopes for a democratization and for some political reform, but in the end, what we're experiencing today is an authoritarian turn, and some experts call Turkey a hybrid regime now, while others are still defining the regime type as competitive authoritarianism. So under this regime, we have observed that a new generation has emerged, a generation that has lived under the Erdogan regime since they were born, and they have not experienced any other political leader. So while the elections are approaching, we see that some media experts as well as academics have turned their attention to the Turkish youth. Can they be a game changer? What kind of political movements do we see in Turkey today? So we're observing that all political parties from left and right are trying to mobilize young people for their own purposes at home and abroad. We see all these established movements such as Kurdish, Alevite, leftist, LGBTI, green activists, as well as Muslim youth organizations going through different kinds of transformations during the last couple of years, since the Gezi protests especially. We also see new grassroots movements emerging as a result of different political developments. Some are becoming more established, some are just sporadic, like especially what we observe on social media. For example, after the students' loans were cancelled, we saw young people took social media platforms to thank Kılıçdaroğlu, for example, rather than Erdogan. This was a short-lived moment, but it was a youth movement still. Or we see what's going on at Boğaziçi University today, and how young people from the alumni, but also students of Boğaziçi are reacting towards this political development. So youth are active, but we need to discuss what kind of agency they have in Turkish politics today.
Let me just say a few words about my own conceptualization and also periodization of youth movements in Turkey, retrospectively speaking, and then come back to your question with a specific focus on the changing face of youth movements during the Justice and Development Party regime. In the literature, we have two different forms of youth political participation. We are all familiar with the conventional forms of political participation, and recently we are more exposed to unconventional forms of youth political participation. By conventional forms, we all know actually that we used to enjoy voting. We used to, enjoy running for office. Sometimes making donations to certain candidates, or writing to the members of the parliaments for certain claims. But these were all old conventional forms of political participation. However, lately, over the last probably 2 decades, in the Turkish context at least, we are more becoming exposed to unconventional forms of political participation. We have seen a lot of different marching of young people, boycotting of young people, disobeying to the laws, civil disobedience, young people becoming more and more reactionary, radical, and protesting about so many different things. So we have seen lately in 2013 during the Gezi protests, the young people have shown us that so many different ways of political participation were possible. So this is the first thing to underline. The second thing, how do we need to make a periodization of youth political participation in Turkey? I have 2 ways of looking at this. One way of periodization is as follows. I think we can talk about the generic, form of youth participation before 2000, before the European integration process started, really. And in that period, we have seen a lot of young people who were accommodated within the Kurdish, political, ethnocultural movement, We have seen an Alevi youth movement. We have seen an Islamist, youth movement. So they were mostly based on ethnocultural and religious claims, probably because of the rise of the identity claims since 1990s and even earlier. And then I've got a second layer of youth political mobilization in Turkey between 2000, I would say, and 2011, where we have seen a growing electoral forms of political participation thanks to the Europeanization of Turkish politics, Turkish state, Turkish society, etc. So we have seen the heydays of electoral political participation of youth in between 2000 and 2011. However, things radically changed since 2011. This is actually what we are going to talk about today. Since 2011, since the consolidation of voters of the AKP, because remember, in 2011 general elections, Justice and Development Party received 49.5% votes. So this was the moment when Erdogan and his entourage consolidated their power, and this was the time when the regime started to become more and more authoritarian, judiciary becoming under the control of the government, and also the media, and also the ways of doing business, etc., etc. So this was the time when the young people started to follow a rather more unconventional forms of political participation. When we look at the claims of young people since then, since 2011, we have seen clearly that there was a discontent against the Islamization of the state and society in Turkey, number one. Number two, there was a very strong discontent, growing discontent against the imposition of certain lifestyles over especially young, secular-minded, liberal-minded people. And the third, growing environmental claims, the claims that we have seen very clearly during the Gezi protests. And finally, we have seen a lot of claims revolving around the right to the city. So this was one way of classifying the very recent history of Turkish young people's movements in general.
Indeed, I second everything Professor Kaya said. He had a great introduction in terms of periodization. What I can say is to kind of also share my research about how this area of youth movements, youth organizations have been shaping by also another current, particularly from 2010, 2013 onwards. Because I feel like we need a bit of qualification here also. What do we mean by youth movements or youth organizations? Obviously, youth is not a single uniform body that a single movement can represent all youth. There are young women, there are young LGBT, young refugees, there are young women refugees, diaspora youth, Kurdish youth, nationalist youth, religious and conservative youth, and so on. So it is very difficult to pinpoint a youth movement and to understand the diversity of youth movement and or actors engaging with the youth emerged in Turkey during the ruling period of the current government. We need to look into basically two interrelated factors over the last 2 decades that have unfolded as a part of the gradual decline of democratic governance and regime change in Turkey that Professor Kaya mentioned. The first is clearly the government's approach to youth and young people. And the second one, the state of social movements or state of civil society in general that has itself also gone through a profound transformation that is of polarization along a more pro-government and more autonomous and oppositional line. So starting with the first issue, we know that youth is an object of interest for all types of regimes, of course. We know this from the literature. All types of political actors from left to right corners of political life consider youth as a long-term pool of electorate, a substantial socio-political group. So it's not surprising to see that all parties and political actors feel obliged to reach out to young people. But the question of youth becomes a little more complicated. That triggers a closer interest, a special attention to youth under the special circumstance of this gradual democratic backsliding and regime change that Turkey over the last decade or so has been going through. And this is why we see a clear interest from the AKP in shaping youth's political and ideological attitudes. And this was clearly expressed by Erdogan, President Erdogan, many times, and repeated by government representatives like raising a pious generation, cultivating a social hegemony, besides the political hegemony, through basically raising this national and authentic youth, cherishing at every instance the so-called 15 July youth against Gezi youth. And the government is obsessed with the idea of youth as the pioneers of the future. In this sense, the youth is considered, on the one hand, as a lethargic entity, vulnerable to degradation by a radical, read liberal and leftist influence. So they are in need of constant training and indoctrination. And on the other hand, we see from the political discourse that the AKP imbues youth with almost a Herculean task of rebuilding Turkey as a powerful nature, and as a powerful nation, sorry. So youth is one of the key groups for the AKP, as a group to be courted, to be organized, trained, and also entertained, as well as protected, so that they can be the new adherents that internalize the goals and value system of this new regime that the AKP has been gradually building up. Of course, adults can be convinced, but the perpetual political education is considered more suitable for youth because their habits, way of life, and ideological orientation can be shaped also for the future. So towards this end, of course, the government employs several agents of socialization. A family is one important medium to train them, to educate the youth. And I must say the family and women policies in this sense cannot be discussed separately from the AKP strategy of this creating desired youth. The other social agent the AKP utilized or tailored for youth long-term indoctrination is school. We know that the education system has been reshuffled countless of times. But besides family of school, a special type of youth movement in the form of government-oriented, government-organized youth organizations has also shouldered an important duty in cultivating this national and authentic youth suitable for internalizing the new regime's value system. So there is this semi-corporative sector within civil society working on specifically youth and education, and they are organized as formal associations and foundations, but they are not a product of young people's initiatives, but they are more encouraged and guided top-down. Yet these organizations have managed to co-opt and incorporate young people from different corners of Turkey and different socio-political backgrounds, thanks to their financial, political, bureaucratic support that they receive from the government. And this debate emerges and subsides quite often in public debate in Turkey, because some journalists reveal some information, and then the main opposition party, CHP's leader, also was revealing some information about the top management level of this organization engaged in some clientelist corrupt activities. But my research shows there is more to this story beyond the top level management of these organizations, the way that they engage with the grassroots. So the most active of those youth organizations have achieved countrywide presence. When I say countrywide, I mean some of these youth organizations are mobilized in every single city, as well as through branches in provinces and also districts in big metropolitan cities. And this extensive organizational capacity has been developed in a few years and should be evaluated against the fact that most of the established youth organizations have only a few branches in the largest cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, and have no means to reach out to rural areas. And these youth organizations have a very statist orientation when they engage with their target audience, that is the young people. And my informants mentioned that it is the joint responsibility of the state and civil society organizations to ensure that youth receives the right guidance. So they combine their ideological status orientation and their remarkable organizational capacity to effectively bring the state, the government, to young people, namely by penetrating everyday life, becoming a part of the daily socialization, activities, and routines of young people, trying to create a mobilized youth bound to the ideology and value system of the government. And often this is the state and nation, loyalty towards the state and the nation. Through their local presence and grassroots engagement, they have created spaces of interaction. And in many areas, they have become the center of politicized leisure. So they have set up myriad of institutionalized ways of reaching out to youth from different age groups, different corners of life, including rural youth, working age or school age young people, first-time voters, university students. And they are organized at public schools, but also outside the curricular schedule through camps, dormitories, some extracurricular training offered free of charge. And their premises offer socialization through libraries, internet, especially in rural areas. These are not freely and readily available for youngsters. They also offer informal gatherings, for example, through free film screenings, seminars, reading groups, and cultural events. They have also, interestingly, capitalized on contentious action, like protests, demonstrations, like the new social movements, including in Turkey, but also organizing some diaspora youth abroad, particularly in Europe. It's quite interesting because usually contentious action is affiliated with progressive politics in our minds, I mean, a tool of minority groups or subaltern groups. Yet through these government organized youth organizations, we see that they can well be utilized towards support of power holders. Youth organizations in this sense engineer political attitudes of youngsters through protests, demonstrations, mainly for two reasons. To display mass support for the government when it faces domestic political crisis, or to show support for a specific foreign policy that promotes the Turkish government as the leader of the third world or the Islamic world, often organized as solidarity marches and protests and demonstrations concerning conflicts in Syria or Yemen civil war, Muslims in Malaysia, Palestinian, Jerusalem issue, so on and so forth. So the type of political agency formed in such settings out of such encounters are very nationalist and conservative one. So my encounters with several youngsters at the premises of these organizations confirm that for many youngsters, their first point of contact with the state, with an authoritarian state, happens through these politicized leisure activities. And youth organizations, if I may add, these youth organizations also actively campaign through electioneering. During critical election times, they carried out such a campaign that sometimes can become more effective when it comes to reaching out to youngsters than the AKP party organization or the party's youth wing, because by using their vast organizational network, they could tailor their campaign for more efficiency. for a wider audience, especially reaching out to first-time voters through their network of dormitories all around Turkey, or those youngsters who were not engaged in voting or politics before. And they have, again, run social media campaigns, physical information desks at key locations in big cities, seminars at universities. Volunteers, for example, patrol the streets to convince youth to vote, particularly during the 2017 constitutional referendum for a yes camp. They made door-to-door visits to shopkeepers or women that do not work by visiting them at their houses. So this is clearly one side of it. But of course, as Professor Kaya was mentioning, this is not the only type of youth mobilization that emerged over the last decade. And this is because under gradual autocratization that we see also an increasing differentiation of youth movements, particularly in general civil society organizations and social movements. And this polarized civil society ecology in Turkey closely affect youth movements also, as Professor Kaya mentioned, that there are also network groups, organizations that have an autonomous and oppositional stance. And this brings me to my initial point about the multiplicity and heterogeneity of youth as a group. So we cannot speak about a single youth organization or movement that would be sufficiently large enough to incorporate all these cross-cutting demands. But maybe we can mention further other types. I get to mention other types of youth organizations, youth movements in the later round.
I should note that first, my observations are based on ethnographic research I conducted in Cizre and Adana and my follow-up visits to these cities in the last 10 years or so. Yeah, in the early 2000s, a new youth movement emerged in the Kurdish region. This movement was based on insurrectionary forms of protest. Almost every day they took to the streets. They clashed with the police using stones, Molotov cocktails, fireworks. And I can say that these protesters were moved by their history of colonial displacement and dispossession. They also articulated very much their aspiration for autonomy, for a life beyond the control of the Turkish state. But what attracted my attention was that these protests occurred in the mode of gameplay. In a way, the police and the protesters gamed each other. Of course, this was a deadly game, and it was deadly only for the protesters, not for the police. For instance, my interlocutors used the analogy of soccer games to describe, their protest. They said when they got tired during the protest, they would take a break, negotiate with the police and take a break. Like the end of the first half of a soccer game, and then after the break, agreed to both parties, that deadly game would continue. These protests resemble game playing also because they involve some interesting concealment tactics, such as dissimulation and impersonation. The protesters try to use these tactics to protect their identities from state surveillance. They also wanted to protect their identities from possible spies, posing as fellow protesters. They believed that the police had deployed, spies to infiltrate their struggle, whether true or not. So they developed various concealment tactics, and they, for example, wore masks, and they used pseudonyms. They changed the way they talked, the way they walked. They assumed a type of another gender, like cross-dressing, and they even created imaginary characters and role play during the protest to kind of make themselves, unidentifiable. So you can then say that they could appear in the public sphere only as somebody else, right, or no one in particular. But this experience of becoming another also afforded youth a space of freedom. It temporarily, at least, allowed them to distance themselves from their social identities and from a life, dominated by extreme poverty and ongoing, political violence. And my interlocutors often mention like how they, kind of put their real life aside, during the protest, how they forgot about their troubles during the protest. Of course, this is a tragic thing because they can create that space of relief only by putting their lives on the line, right? And many were arrested, many were killed, many were injured. And this kind of activism, however, came to an end after the war, urban warfare, in between 2015 and 2016. And the public, after this war, the public sphere, which is the street in the Kurdish region and probably in other parts of Turkey, was closed down. And a public space that was opened with the when the AKP came to power was closed down by the same regime during that war. And since then, the so-called, I would say, the so-called digital public space of Twitter, Facebook, maybe TikTok replaced or displaced the street. This is a so-called, I said like so-called because it's this public space is not public, it's privately owned. But I maybe later can talk about as a general statement, like why this kind of protest actually cannot transform political structures. Maybe it has a concrete function in their lives, but as in general, I think cannot really transform political structures.